Well, welcome everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Migration Tools, the True Cost of Free. My name is Doug Stewart, and I'm the Senior Director of Solutions Consulting at OpenText. In today's webinar, we'll take a deep dive into the topic of server and data migrations, and we'll pay particular attention to the tools used to perform these migrations. Specifically, we'll highlight and demo OpenText Migrate, focusing on the types of problems the solution solves for our customers. And for those not familiar with OpenText Migrate, it's used to quickly and easily migrate physical, virtual, and cloud servers over any distance with minimal downtime or risk of data loss. The Migrate product came to OpenText via the December 2019 acquisition of Carbonite. And now the product is called OpenText Migrate, but it was formerly known, or AKA, it was Carbonite or DoubleTake. You may have heard of the product under those brand names. So today, two of our OpenText migration experts are here to share their experience and expertise on this topic. Joining our discussion today is David Mee, Senior Solutions Architect, and Derek Chapin, Senior Solutions Consultant. So welcome, David and Derek.
Hey guys, it's a pleasure to be here, Doug.
Great. And our agenda today is super concise, as you can see on screen. David will begin by addressing the concept of the cost of free as it relates to migration tools. He will also address key factors that determine migration success. And then Derek will introduce the OpenText Migrate product and provide a demonstration of the solution. But before we jump in, a couple of housekeeping notes. We plan about 40 minutes of discussion and presentation to be followed up by about 10 minutes of Q&A at the end. So as questions come to mind, please use the chat panel to submit your questions. And given that we're a small group today, we'll definitely try to take those answers kind of in line as they come in, but if we can't, we'll definitely address them at the end of the presentation. And then lastly, we're recording today's session, and a link of the recording will be provided to all attendees. With that, I'll turn it over to you, David.
Thanks, Doug, and thanks everybody for your time and attendance here today. Let me share my screen. I gotta grab that. To start, most of what we talk about here is not new to you. If you're attending this session, it's probably because you already know the challenges of a migration, or you've heard of some tragic migration project failure, or an extremely expensive migration project. The goal of this session is to help you to look at migrations and migration tools in a different light. It's our hope that your next migration project will not be added to the infamous list of what not to do in a migration project. Historically, all migrations were a concern. It didn't matter if it was an application, server, or the entire data center. Now, individual servers are less scary, and VM to VM migrations are somewhat simple, especially if it's a LAN connection between the same hypervisors. However, a migration project with many servers is often described as risky, painful, resource intense, time-consuming, or just not fun. Descriptors like these are often associated with extended project time, increased project cost, and high project risk. When the risk is high, you tend to add extra steps to shield you from that risk. A simple example is database extractions before server migrations. What's the reason for the extra step? Are you trying to protect the database from recovery, or are you trying to protect the migration? The answer is doesn't matter. It's to reduce the risk of the whole project. If the migration fails, can you just import the database and save the migration? Those are the things you think about when you're actually doing these migrations. Again, when it's painful, you take extra steps to lessen the pain. It's things like a smaller migration set or waves, migration waves, which will result in longer project timelines, which increases the cost of the project, which introduces additional project risk. Activities defined as resource intense include some critical path items and short time slots. Often these activities can introduce errors, so more processes are added to the entire project. You might have to throw in some automation through scripting. some additional reviews or testing. Do some platform-specific validation. Do you guys have the bash skills and the PowerShell skills you need? Do you have everything you need to do the DNS and Active Directory testing? Do you have the skill sets to perform the Hyper-V or hyperscaler provider testing? Again, these are all steps to minimize project risk, but they can also cause longer project timelines, increase project costs, and they could actually introduce schedule risk. That's when you have to compete with time and resources and calendars. When they're time consuming, part is usually associated with the continual repeating tasks. You have to negotiate and establish initial sync points for each environment. You might even have to set up some infrastructures and load the OSs, set up some scripts. There's a bunch of things you need to do that is a repeating process that you have to do for every server. Then when you're looking at the custom scripting, are you going to really write an application to do it, or do you have to each time you do the script, you have to modify things for the environment or the validation that you're working on? Then you have to do the application analysis, the wave and post cutover planning. Those are all repeatable steps that are just time consuming. Again, most of these require additional but different steps for each process. You go to an internal process and best practices. Are you using a custom Excel spreadsheet or a third-party asset tool to figure out what servers or what systems you need to migrate? Are you actually using a third-party integrator? That's, these are all things you have to take into consideration with your project. Each additional process adds project time. More project time means more costs and potentially more risk. All these descriptors can be wrapped up into a general statement. It's just not fun. Historically, people said you had to do a migration project and you'd share them on, oh, that's just not fun. You got hours of planning and review. You have to do all those environmental setups and analysis. Repeating the configuration task, like I said earlier, just redo, cut and paste redo. You have an intense focus on a lot of activities and an impossible amount of work in a very short amount of time. Then the best part is you get these long hours of waiting for something to happen. You get a variable duration to finish a process or a project step, just waiting until it finishes. And then once it finishes, you have this tiny window of time to complete a whole bunch of next steps to get it done in the time window. Then add to the just not fun part. It's extremely late or very early in the mornings, or you have to work on weekends and holidays to get this done. Again, key factors, all brings it into time, cost, and risk. So as you can see, these types of descriptors increase the project time, the resource costs, and it's all for a single purpose, to reduce risk. It's clear you need to reduce the risk, so you have to consider the skills needed to perform the migration with risk reduction in mind. You have to find the subject matter experts. Do they know Windows? Great, but what about Red Hat or SUSE or Ubuntu? You need special processes for each application. Who knows that application? Is it who knows the accounting application or that other application for HR? Unique talents based on the target environments. If you're running server to server, you might already have those talents, but what if you're going to a hyperscaler? Which hyperscaler? You got to get the talents for that hyperscaler. Then you have older or non-standard environments that you have to migrate. And then you got outdated hardware, like the little black box sitting over in the corner. Who owns that one? Well, each of these items can add time, resource, and cost to your project and were probably not considered in the upfront costing of the project.
We're seeing time, cost, and risk over and over again, aren't we?
Yeah.
David,
yeah, that's the thing when you look at migrations is, I'm gonna go do this migration. How much time, how much risk am I going to be able to recover? Those are all key factors in any true cost-free project, figuring all this stuff out. So it's no surprise that time's directly related to the cost. Adding risk reduction steps adds time and resources, which the resources are a cost. More time, more cost. Cost in itself does not reduce risk. you have to plan for it, you have to make sure you're reducing the risk. So a lot of times the time and resources and risks are all part of an unaccounted price of true cost of free as well. To help reduce the risk, you start looking for assistance through automation and tooling. Again, how much PowerShell do you guys need? How much bash skills do you guys have if you're doing Linux? Do you need to understand all the databases? What about clusters or DAGs?
I know it's not my turn yet, David, but isn't it great that OpenText Migrate, you don't need to have that database interaction. You don't need to have that skill set on hand.
100% true. The Carbonite product works below the application layer, so it doesn't need to do anything with the databases. It gives you the advantage of just moving everything over. However, if you do need to just move like a SQL database, there are ways that we can actually move the SQL database, upgrade the SQL database to a new operating system or even a new version of SQL. But that's a different presentation.
Mm-hmm.
So when we go through this process, you still look at all the things you need to understand about the environment. And then you have to consider the scripting team themselves, the people who are writing those scripts. Will they be able to script out the work across multiple servers or domains? Do they have the correct authority, or do they have access to the source? Those are all things you have to consider, and those are all things you have to take steps to address. Does the script that you're using need VM host level access or require the security team to approve it? Yeah, one of the questions is, do you even have host level access to your VM? Those are all in the consideration when you're doing your project planning. All of those, we're going to add those risks, add those steps. So it's adding steps for scripting will add additional steps in the project. Things to consider that often are not at the beginning of the planning is locking out the users for their data. Do I have to shut the system down? Do I have to restrict access to the environment? What about rebooting or extending the maintenance window? When you do this project and you're doing the planning and you're looking at the cost of a migration, are you going to have to add each time you go back and reboot or extend the maintenance window? Which, by the way, means you have to go back to the project change request board and request time for that. All of its time and materials and resource. Then you look at the business itself. Are you limiting the business as usual aspect of the project? Can they do reboots and config changes and patches? Can they put on a new OS patch or application patch? If the migration is postponed, do they need to reset everything and restart the whole process? These are the considering steps that you have to look at the cost of free. Remembering, adding steps increases project time, which is an intrinsic cost in itself. If those costs can be streamlining the process or simplifying the overall solution and reducing the risk, then they're a good thing. Then you want to do them. If they're not, obviously, if they're not doing that, then don't add those steps. Often at this point in the project, when you're going through analysis, you start looking to vendors to provide tools. Most of the vendors will provide tools, by the way. Most vendors will have some sort of tool to help migrations. And many of them are claiming that they're free. And in most cases, they really do work until they don't work for some specific need you have. You know, like that little black box sitting over in the corner that you still don't know who owns it. Those are all things you need to consider on the migrations. So let's take a look at other questions. When you're talking to the vendor and say, oh, our stuff's free, what should you be asking them about free? How long is it free? And what's the cost if you exceed free? Does free include additional services or servers or storage or CPU or memory or any infrastructure that you may or may not use once you're done with the migration? Do you need a third-party license to complete the migration? Some of the tools out there actually require you to get a mobile license for mobile computing. So you have to consider that, ask those questions. Can it migrate physical servers using the same process and workflow, or do you have to adopt an entirely new process and skill set to do a physical versus a virtual versus a hyperscale? Does it require a dedicated bandwidth, high bandwidth environment, or can it work over a high latency, low bandwidth network?
And that touches on even job scheduling, right? Migration job scheduling and throttling.
Correct. There's a lot of projects that I've worked on where the user says, yeah, I got this network, but it's shared with everything. Can you replicate the data after 5 p.m.? Sure, that's not a problem. We have a lot of customers who require scheduling. So you could schedule and throttle with the Carbonite replication engine, Carbonite Migrate. Then can you exclude unwanted files or folders? Those are things that, when you're doing replication, you might not want to bring some stuff across. You might want to just leave it there, or not bring it to the new environment. What happens if you have a need to change the target size or right size the environment? Or maybe you have a huge one volume that's 10 terabyte. Can you do larger volumes? Can it move to multiple server, multiple targets, or from multiple source systems? Can you consolidate or distribute the workload, or is it a one-to-one like for like? In the event you're doing the migration and something happens, can you fall back to the original location, even if it's a physical? Many of the providers don't. Once you get to the virtual world, you're out in the virtual world. You can't fall back to physical. Other things to consider is making sure you're doing your migration with an eye to the future. Does it support newer technologies like hardware, like the hardware changes or different infrastructure changes? Questions you might want to ask is, does it support Azure Stack Hub or AWS Outposts? Does it support universal SSDs, which are basically SSDs with 4K sectors? Or a newer feature like Azure VMware Services, or AVS, where you run VMware on Azure. Other things that you look at too is, how do you get the data across and get it in sync? Can they use their own external tools to precede, like Snowball or Azure Stack Databox or Google Transport Device, or even taking an old save and restore, or I should say an old save and restoring it to your target destination? With the Carbonite product, you could actually do all of those things. Can it perform a checksum difference mirror after the network disconnects? So that one's basically, what happens if I have a network disconnect? I'm in sync. I just moved my 2 terabytes of information to the target. It's almost done. I'm almost ready to cut over, but I have a disconnect. What happens? What do I have to do to recover it? Some things to look at too. Does it store any data prior to sending it? If it does, is that data compliant? Does it follow all the regulations around data on disk or data at rest? Those are things that you really want to look at, making sure that you're keeping compliant with all the regulations as you're doing the migration. What about encrypted storage? Does it have a trouble with BitLocker? Yeah, go ahead.
Right, I was going to say, and specifically, does it support 256-bit encryption in transit, the AES level?
Correct. So that's the AES 256-bit encryption in transit. Right. You have other avenues where you have hardware encryption and different types of software encryption. The Carbonite engine or the OpenText Migrate does not have to read the data, so we don't worry about any of that. Some things coming out in the future. Everybody's looking at more security, so more environmental safety. So you have an air-gapped environment. Can it run on an air-gapped environment? Does it support the .govs, the AWS and Azure and Google .govs, for example? Is it a crash-consistent recovery? The OpenText replication engine was built for availability, so it does have a crash-consistent recovery capability. That basically means if it fails during the migration, you can just cut over and we're at the point of failure and you can start there. Does it have the same workflow for Windows as it does on Linux? Doesn't even support Linux. Some of the other items that you might not consider up front are older versions of the OS, Windows 2003 or 2008 R1. Can you migrate those?
Right. And how old? How old can you go back?
Yeah, the replication engine that we're talking about, the OpenText replication engine, has been around since the 90s. So we currently have people asking us to do Windows 2000 and NT migration still. We're not going to talk. That's a completely different seminar, by the way. So yeah, when you look at things, the scripting, maybe you guys have some tools that you want to use and you want to integrate it with. Does it support integration through PowerShell and RESTful APIs? In the end, when you get through all those, in the end, most of the migrations are split between a manual effort, scripted pieces, multiple vendor tools, and complete greenfield where you're just going to stand it up and move the users over there. So let's get back to the original point on the true cost of free. Risk mitigation adds steps to the project. Steps add time, and time adds cost. And those are all part of the unaccounted for price and the true cost of free. If you're not considering these things when you're doing it, whether you pay for the license or not, no license cost doesn't mean it's free. It just means there's no license cost. The added resources, infrastructure, and services that may not be used after the cutover, along with the limitations or selected resources for the source and target system, those all add up. Those are all costs that you need to consider when you're doing your migrations. Many times you find out after you've gone through the unaccounted cost of free, it doesn't reduce the level of risk that you think it should. You're not really dropping your risk factors with these. You're just not paying a license. So here's some examples of some real world migration projects that I've done. So we're looking at migrations. You have 5, 10, 15 servers in a wave, and on cutover, one of them fails. Can you just reset and restart that one server and cut it over to save the migration wave? So I've actually been in projects where we've had a target Linux box on cutover. When it rebooted, it failed. So we went back to the source. We rebooted the source to get things going so we could remirror, and the source failed too. Turns out that they applied a Linux patch that required a reboot. They never did the reboot on the source. That environment didn't start, so we were able to troubleshoot it, back out the patch, bring that source back up, start replication again, and get it back in sync thanks to our difference mirror. And we were able to cut that one server over all within the same time window. And that enabled that entire wave to go. If we didn't make that, that wave would have had to cut back or fail back, and it would have been a failed migration. I can't tell you how many times I've been in migrations where we're about ready to go, and 5 minutes before we go do the cutover, the manager comes in and says we have to postpone it for whatever reason. We can't do it until next weekend. If you're using a free tool, can you just stop and say, okay, come back next weekend? Carbonite, the OpenText replication engine, OpenText Migrate, was built on availability. It's intended to keep things in sync near real time. So sure, we're just going to let it run for another week, and when we come back next week, we just push the button. The next two bullets are kind of similar. You have two different targets. One's a hypervisor and one's a cloud. Or you have a hyperscale provider A and you have everything planned and ready to go. And then you say, no, we have to go to hyperscale provider B. Do you have to change your steps? Can you just say, okay, let's go? Those are all questions that you need to consider, because with the replication engine that we have, OpenText Migrate, it's the same process, whether it's a hyperscaler, physical server, or hypervisor. We just say, sure, we'll hold off until we get everything set, and then we'll just go using the same process. So when deciding what tool works best for migrations, consider the true cost of free versus the license fee for an OpenText Migrate, for example. Remember to include risk factors, resource requirements, setup, cutover times, and the other bulleted items that we talked about here. Those are all part of the factors. Last thought for you here. Some additional steps additional concepts you should consider for the true cost of free. Just because you have servers out there that can take a 24-hour outage or more, doesn't mean you should. When you're doing that when you're performing the manual backup, setup, restore, it doesn't mean it's cheaper. It just means you're not paying a license fee. You still have all this added cost, the resource, the risk to get it all done manually. With OpenText Migrate, you don't need to freeze your business like I talked earlier. It keeps your system state in sync, your application and metadata, everything in sync. So as you're adding patches and fixes and your business as usual is running, we're sending that information across to the target. Everything can be configured through a simple Windows-based console. That console is not required to be running at any time other than setup configuration and if you want to monitor the status. No data goes through the console. We do have alternatives as well. We have an alternative browser-based interface for specific workloads. It's called Carbonite Cloud Migration. It's a completely different webinar as well, but that can do some pretty cool stuff with Azure and AWS and auto provisioning. If you're interested in it, you can get to migrate.doubletake.com, and that will show you that alternate browser. We also can do integration through PowerShell and REST API. When I say the integration, it's full. Other than installing the product, everything you need to do can be done through the REST API or through PowerShell. So those are some of the things to consider on your true cost to free. At this point, I'm going to turn over the presentation to Derek. So again, we're going to show you, he's going to give you some examples of how flexible everything is and how easy it is to complete a migration with OpenText Migrate. So Derek, take it away.
And hey, Derek, right before you jump in, I just want to remind everybody, please feel free to use the chat panel to submit any questions that you might have. And I'm going to send a little message on there. So hopefully you can identify it and submit your questions, and we will try to get to those as they come in. So thanks, Derek.
Great, thank you. Thank you, David. That was great. You really have made some excellent points. And now it's time. Let me show you how easy it is to use OpenText Migrate to address those needs and pain points that David brought up. And how to address, and as we're all aware, we don't want to replace that free. So how to address them by not replacing free with complex. I'm confident this demo that I'm about to show with using OpenText Migrate, that your investment will not equal complexity. So now by now you should be able to see my screen, and you can see pretty quickly that this demo environment that we're going to use today, this is what I'd like to consider a pretty good example of some server sitting out there. This is a VM to VM migration, but as David mentioned, this could be physical to VM, VM to physical, VM to cloud, physical to cloud. You really get the point. It's anything to anything. But just because of the tools I have, this will be a VM to VM. This production server is, I tried to simulate a real world example. I have a pretty old weak, just a dual CPU with 8 gigs of memory production server that's running quite a bit of software over here. It's actually running 2 of our other OpenText superstar products, Brava and Blazon. And as a side note, if you're looking for an enterprise HTML viewer, Brava is your answer. Or if you need an enterprise rendition engine to automatically transform files from virtually any format, Blazon is your answer. But I digress. You can clearly tell that I work with those products intimately as well. So here we are. We have a full production server. We can take a look at what's installed on here, where we have a bunch of services running. We got Brava and Blazon services running. We also have a Tomcat running as our web app server. And we can even see on this production server that I'm pointing to localhost, that it's even up and running, that everything's a go. Let's see, on this system, the only thing I've had to install is the Carbonite or the OpenText Migrate tool, which did not require a reboot. And then if I take us over to what the IT department has provided us, they gave us a new server, a completely empty slate. They did hit my requirements or my requests, which is that's always a plus. I got a quad core now with 16 gigs of RAM. This system's is called Migration, just because that's the name I gave them. As we can see here, when I open up services, it doesn't have any of the Brava Blazon services pre-installed. We don't even have Tomcat on this machine. So if I was to go into Chrome, I could quickly see that if I was to point to that, I already pre-plugged that same URL in that we were looking at on the production server. And of course, there's nothing could be hit. So this is an empty slate. It just as we would expect. We did put Carbonite, OpenText Migrate on this system as well, which also did not require a reboot. And then we also installed it on my workstation. We installed the replication console, which is just a quick console. All this comes in with one license. You get the license for the source and the target and a workstation for the console. And so it was all set up, pre-set up just for the sake of time, and is running as we speak. I can kind of demo real quick if I was, here, let's go into both systems. We can see that OpenText Migrate is even though it's running in the background right now, our production server is 100% available for use. Not all we've done is set up and prepare the job. It is the production server has been uninterrupted. We could go ahead and simply, I'm going to just simulate adding content to the production server. You know, I just put that copy there. And because I have OpenText Migrate running and we're in protection mode, if we were to go over to our target server, we would quickly see if I scroll down, input copy has just arrived on here as well, because as the migrate tool is protecting the production server, is keeping the two systems in sync as it's in use. We're not limited to what we can do on the production server as well. We can install software. We can actually modify. I'm going to create this as a sharing folder just to simulate modifying registry edits. And so, oops, there we go. So that's all been turned on. And so when this job is done, we should be able to check and see if all this stuff copied over. So we have a huge advantage that we can install OpenText Migrate on our server, and prior to the very moment that we need to migrate it over, we could get everything set up in advance and feel really comfortable that it's going to happen. We can feel comfortable because we're being told by our console that it is in protecting mode and that everything looks fine. We can look down and see that we have content like bytes were just sent this morning because I simulated a reboot, or I simulated some scenarios, and so it copied over an additional 3 gigs of data that had changed, that had been modified. And so I really believe that we're now ready to actually do the cutover. We can do that in a couple ways. I'm just going to click the toolbar key. We have multiple different versions of cutovers that could happen. We could just run a test cutover, which is important. One of the things that we heard over and over again is just the risk of knowing that it will work. And so to have that comfort of knowing that we can actually do test cutovers can really alleviate some of that risk. So we're going to start the cutover. So the cutover has started, and right away we can immediately see that our production server is now shutting down. Now I like to bring this up. I've brought this up a couple times about the production server being rebooted. I really am trying to make a point that the production server never was interrupted during the any of the process of setting everything up. There was never became any interruptions where you had to explain to a business unit that, hey, I need to reboot, or things need to be set up in some way. So you didn't have to come in on the weekends to prepare for this, and that we can't emphasize enough how important that is to make this a seamless and a painless operation. So now that that's happening in the background, I figured, why don't we go ahead and take a look at what that job consisted of that I just executed, because there was a little bit of magic there going on where it was already all set up. We're not quite sure what was set up. And I thought, what a great opportunity while this is running. We're kind of taking a virtual coffee break here, because that's the amount of time it takes. It takes less than 10 minutes for this whole thing on this environment to complete. Sometimes it only takes 3 or 4 minutes, but we always feel really confident saying it takes less than 10 minutes. And so let's take a look at what this job is that we set up. So because it's worked, because it's doing a cutover, I didn't want to actually manipulate and create a new job while it's doing the cutover. So I just took some quick screenshots, and hopefully we can all bear with me through a few more of these just to see, okay, what did it look like to create that job that's running? So the first thing you do when you create a job is you define what's the workflow that we're going to execute. We got a bunch of workflows to do. We can see it's kind of neat that the SQL workflow is de-highlighted because it knows that I didn't have SQL Server on the machine that I chose to do this cutover. If we were to choose files and folders, we can specify what files and what folders, but of course we're doing a full server migration. With any of these jobs, we can also really dig in deep and look at replication rules if that's what we wanted to do. I know, David, you have run into a lot of stories where these replication rules have kind of saved the day.
Oh yeah.
Do you want to share one of those?
Yeah, so in the replication rules, you add the path, you select include or exclude or recursive, and you can use the masks. So the masking is available, so you can actually set up for replicating everything except your logs or star.bak files. I actually had one client a while ago who found out that his server was being used as an MP3 music server. He decided to exclude all of those MP3s on his target destination. That way he didn't have to store everybody's music. So yeah,
right.
Lots of value there.
Yes. So again, we just love having this level of control. We can't tell you how often that it can come up where customers can feel like their hands are tied because they don't have this level of defining the rules that they want to do. Now, speaking of that, these options, it's loaded. We're loaded with options to be able to define this job. We'll just hit a couple again because we're just trying to give a little bit of time to the job to run. And let's take a look at that job now. Let's see where it's at. So we can see where it's failing over. It's already 51% of the way failed over. So it's just clipping right along. And so it's neat to know that with this specific job that I've run, I used all the defaults. It's even though we might go into a little bit of detail and sometimes it might feel a little like, oh, there's a lot here, and it seems complex. It's also neat to know that I just boom clicked right through and created your basic full server failover job.
Exactly, Derek. So to drive home that point, it's been around. The product's been around since the 90s. We've had years of experience. So most of the cases, you'll be able to take the defaults. There are a few things that we'll show here that you want to pay attention to, but as Derek said, it's years of experience set these defaults. So most people just use those simple defaults.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And we'll actually just touch on some of the ones that we consider that are really the neatest ones out there. Some of them are pretty basic in the failover options. Really the message we wanted to get across is you get predictable cutover times with OpenText Migrate. Regardless of the activities, regardless of the data set size, you can control the cutover time. And we see that with the very first option of saying, hey, wait for the user to initiate failover. But we've also been in situations where we would want the failover to happen right away. So we just have that control, and we see that control over and over again throughout all these option sets. I also do like to point out, because it's actually just happened to me just recently and actually preparing for this demo. You see the shut down the source server. That makes sense to everyone. I think when you're done with the migrate, you don't need that original server. So that's not interesting in itself. But what is neat is that source server being shut down nothing changed on that source server. And I think David touched on it. If there's anything that goes wrong, if while the new target server is coming up, and let's say we're getting some of the Southwest states are getting some crazy weather right now, and we have a little power blip, and the cutover got interrupted, all you have to do is turn that source server back on, and your applications and your production server is back up and running. And it's, can't stress that enough, again, because we know the stress in I kind of joke about the nail biting of as this migration's happening. And let's see where we're at now. We're now at 95%. So as this is happening under, I remember the days where I just would be biting my nails saying, please work, because if it doesn't work, we're in big trouble, big trouble. We can actually see now that it's starting to, the migrate server is even rebooting. So we're getting to that phase. So you can see how quickly this is happening. We have other options that we'll hit on real quick. The mirror verify orphaning. We've mentioned that this is a two-step migration process. You have that synchronizing that happens up front, and then that constant protection mode going on. David, you want to tell that story about? Yes, go ahead.
Yes. So the focus here is on the different options allow you to do different things. So you can schedule verifications and nice parts, but the thing we're focused on here is the delete orphan files. So the product, the OpenText migration engine was built on availability. So its original concept was making sure the target and source are identical. If somebody goes over to the target and adds a file, the replication engine with the delete orphan files flagged checked will actually remove it. Right. You can uncheck it, and that allows you to put things on the target that don't exist on the source. That's something that you'd look at when you're using file and folder mostly, or if you're going to use that target for some other purpose while migrating or while replicating. So you could do things with it like we have path mapping that you could replicate information from source to target into a different target path. You'd want to turn off delete orphan files, because if that path doesn't exist on the source, we try to delete it. So it's things like that you can do, consolidation and distribution of the files.
Yep. And this is where you wouldn't want to delete orphan files. Say if the IT department gave you your new target server that had maybe an asset tracking tool on it. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. Until cutover, you want that target to be tracked in the asset management tool. So you'd say, don't delete the stuff that's over there, because I'm going to manage it. Exactly correct, Eric.
Yeah. And that's, we've seen where the migration is happening because the production server is so old, you can't put some of the newer IT required software on it. So you need to migrate to a newer one. And now you can get that pre-set up. That's a powerful feature. We're going to blaze through some of this because I imagine we're almost ready to get to the real ta-da moment. Yeah. So let's jump. Actually, let's take a stop. I know everyone just loves going through PowerPoint slides, but let's take a look and see what's actually happening in our environment right now. We see that it's saying that the migration's done. It's also telling us that, hey, I can't find your target anymore. Well, that's because the target does not exist. The target is now the production server, right? It's, if we were to open this up, we now see this, even though it's my migrate VM, we can see that the new host name is Bravo Blazon. We can see, now we're looking at some of this stuff. We're seeing that, well, what's going on here? Why does it still say gigs of memory? Well, that's because, of course, I need to update BG info. Whoops, oh, look at that. Isn't that neat? You gotta love that. Wait for it. See if I can clear it out. Well, we were going to see that, of course, BG info is going to give us a little bit of a headache, but that happened. The point being that you might be able to make out that we're looking at 16 gigs of RAM and the quad core system. Now, I actually intentionally didn't update BG info because one of the things that we can control back on the jobs is we could have told it to do scripts, to run scripts. We can see down here in order to maybe update the actual BG info information. But I wanted to be able to show and speak of that. So now let's see if the only hiccup is just the BG info font. We can now see pointing still at the local host. Our Tomcat is up and running. And not only is Tomcat up and running, but all the Brava and Blazon services must be up and running, because now we're going to go right into here and actually start our actual web server client, our Brava client. And it came right up to view. So everything's sitting here. Of course, our old server, our old production server is still powered down because everything seems to be working. We don't need it anymore. We can even see when we go back into our replication console that now that it can't find the old Brava Blazon, but it found the new Brava Blazon, and it moved over the Carbonite, the OpenText Migrate license. It moved that over because if you wanted to then migrate this again, you still have that availability if it hasn't expired. And of course, it can't find the old migration server either. So you could at this point just delete them from this job list if you wanted to. So now let's go back to see if there's anything else that we wanted to talk about for the options. We could certainly touch on, we got compression. Not only can you do compression, but David and I mentioned that whole fixed bandwidth limits and scheduling, which couldn't be more valuable in some of these large organizations that we work with. Yeah.
Exactly. I have one story I could tell you where we had a client who had multiple time zone regions where we actually set up servers based on their time zone. And so we'd have multiple schedules out there where they'd be running, what's it, 8 a.m., 9 a.m. on the west coast of the United States is 5 p.m. in London. So we had the console running a global migration where 8 a.m. Pacific time, it would restrict the bandwidth. 5 p.m. London time, it would open up the bandwidth. We do compression and scheduling as well.
Yeah. It again, just the flexibility is in every caveat that has been thought of since the 90s, as you mentioned. We have constantly put in options to make sure that this goes as flawlessly as possible, and interestingly enough, even ahead of schedule and easier than anticipated, right? Which is why the job actually finished before we were even able to talk about what made up the job. We're able to see here's kind of the neat pre-flight checklist when you're setting up a job, and are you sure that you've covered all your all the things that needed to be covered, and it kind of gives you this reassurance that, hey, as far as OpenText Migrate is concerned, everything looks good. Everything's covered. You have enough space on your hard drive, on your target hard drive. The network bandwidth is set up. I know where I'm sending information. It is ready to go. And as you can see, it went. We'll go back to the job. There's really, we just know that it just worked. So with that, that is a presentation of OpenText Migrate. We have some great value that comes with the investment, and it just works, as you can see. It works very smoothly. With that, I turn the time back over to Doug and see if there's any questions that came up.
Well, great. Excellent job, David and Derek. And we didn't get any questions in the chat, but as I mentioned, we did collect those internal questions from our various teams, including support. So I'm going to run through just a few of them. In the interest of time, maybe we can take the next 3 to 5 minutes, run through some of these questions, and then we'll wrap up and give everybody a few minutes back in their day. So let me switch over and go into the Q&A. And Derek and David, I think we'll just alternate since these are the pre-written questions. So Derek, I'll start with you. You know, one question that comes up a lot, I know on calls is how is OpenText Migrate licensed?
Sure. I touched on it real quickly while we were looking at the software. It's an instance of the OS. So with one license of OpenText Migrate, you get a source server that you get to install on, and you get to move that to a target server. And that's
great. Yep. Excellent. And then David, this one I've heard voiced in a couple different ways, but you know, we saw that it didn't require much downtime, but does migrating with OpenText Migrate always require downtime?
Only at cutover. The modern versions of the environment can install, set up, configure, and do replication and mirroring and difference mirroring all without any downtime of the source. At cutover time, that cutover is based on the time it takes to boot, not the time it takes to do a difference mirror or a difference mirror. We're always in sync, or we're trying to be always in sync. So cutovers are basically how long does it take to boot the server. Now, historically, the product brand name was called DoubleTake, and historically, older versions did require a reboot at times. So some people might remember, oh, that's the product that used to require a reboot. It was actually the .NET version that required the reboot, and Microsoft fixed that. So, yep. So the short answer of this long answer is no, we do not require a reboot other than cutover.
Right, and back then everybody required reboot.
True, it was a .NET requirement, not a product requirement.
Got it. And Derek, the third question here, this one's a little more technical, but can I use OpenText Migrate to migrate an EXI host to another server?
Well, the OpenText Migrate, it actually runs at the Windows or Linux OS level. It's not at the hypervisor hosting level. So the VMs attached to the EXI host can all be migrated, but you wouldn't actually migrate the host, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. Got it.
Yeah. Okay. And then I'd like to expand on that for a second. Is the other thing too on that is, even though we don't run at the host, we are able to cross host technologies. Yeah. So one of the things that is recent is a lot of host servers are Intel based, but AMD has stepped up their game, and now it's a lot cheaper and just as powerful to do an AMD secured host. Back on that whole hardware conversation we had, that works fine. We don't have any problem going from an ESX or ESXi or Hyper-V host to running Intel to a secured AMD host. It doesn't bother us at all.
Got it. Okay. And David, this one's for you. Given all your experience with the product and working with customers, how long does it take for somebody to get up to speed on the Migrate product, or learn how to use the Migrate product?
Because it's not a big learning curve. If you're a systems operator or an admin, or if you run, if you have the experience of setting up and getting computers to talk to each other over a network, which most people in the IT world do, that's all it really takes. There's no magic. We're just opening up a few ports. It's an agent running on your source, talking to an agent running on your target, and obviously you need the admin authorities, but a couple hours at most, and our documentation is pretty good too. So,
yeah, great. And then a question that I know comes up frequently too is how much does it cost? How much does Migrate cost, Derek?
Well, we really would push that to the AE to discuss details, but there's various licensing options depending on the job needed. So you check with an account executive, and they'll be able to give you all the information you need to know exactly which one you want that you require.
Great. And yeah, for everybody on the call today, we have a general way to reach your account exec if you don't know who it is. It's this IGC_sales@opentext.com email address. So please feel free to reach out using that email address. You can reach out to us via that email address as well. I think we've got a few. Let's take one more. So David, can I migrate data from my NAS or SAN storage using Migrate?
That gets a little bit more complicated. NAS and SAN storage are generally remote storage units, but you can treat them as a local storage device sometimes. The OpenText Migrate product does utilize a local file system to do the replication. So for Windows, it's NTFS or EFS. For Linux, you're running ext. 2, 3, 4, or XFS or something like that. So those are all considered local file systems. As you write to disk, the I/O gets written to disk. We're seeing that I/O, sending that I/O to the target, and applying that I/O through the file system. So if your NAS storage is running an NTFS file system, a note, if you're running iSCSI or Fiber Channel, then you're running an NTFS or a local file system. You have that access. So if you're running a local file system, then you could use Carbonite. Some of the to set a clear picture, if you're using something like a NetApp storage array, but you're running VMware and using NetApp as your storage, VMware is actually striping that storage with NTFS for Windows. So yes, we can do a migration that way. However, if you're running XFS, a CIF, or a SMB file system, those are all considered remote file systems. So remote file systems are not something we could read. Those would have to be migrated through another path. For example, copying them over your iSCSI link into a file system we could read and then sending it, which I've done that before too.
Got it. Well, my takeaway there is it gets a little more complicated when you're dealing with those remote storages, but definitely contact us. We would definitely love to talk to you about it. As you can tell, David and Derek have tons of experience in this area. Well, with that, we better wrap up so we make sure we end on time. So, you know, that unfortunately it is all the time we have today, but David and Derek, I think you did a great job. Thanks for being with us today, for sharing your expertise, you know, around migrations generally, but also around the OpenText Migrate tool specifically. You know, one takeaway from me was, you know, you know, your presentation was genuinely interesting, but the thing that I really loved about it is the information presented was super practical and actionable. You know, David, your portion I could apply to almost any job or any project that I'm running, and so it was a really good set of reminders. So good job there. And to our attendees, thanks for joining the webinar today. If you have any follow-up questions or would like to talk with one of us, you know, please feel free to reach out. We have the email address that I already mentioned, the igc_sales@opentext.com is a great way to get a hold of us. There's also a couple other resources listed on this slide that you might find useful. Don't try to write down this really long URLs right now. As I mentioned, all attendees will receive a link to the recording of the presentation as well as a copy of this presentation. So again, thank you everybody for joining us today. Special thanks to David and Derek for sharing their insights and expertise, and have a wonderful day, and we'll see you at our next webinar. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.